34 felonies. 34 felonies is what former President Trump is charged with. It's Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg's decision to chop up the alleged hush money payment to Stormy Daniels into 34 separate crimes, felonies all. The Times Union in New York, outlet there, did a little look-see at how often the business records law is invoked for a state-level prosecution, and how many times the charge is a felony, the first-degree falsifying business records with the intent to commit another crime to aid or conceal the commission thereof. That's the standard for leveling it up to a felony charge. It's happened 8 times in the last 4 years in the Manhattan DA's office. Statewide, they report there have been fewer than 300 such cases under the State Business Records Act since 2019. And the important point here, the most common outcome, a guilty plea to disorderly conduct, which under New York law is a sub-misdemeanor offense that's punished usually by a fine, which is actually what was said by some legal commentators at the outset. This is normally how these cases are adjudicated because they had some experience in New York and with records of this sort in other states that are sort of similarly adjudicated. So just that backstory in response to the, hey, this is just another day at the office and nobody's above the law and this is consistent with equal treatment before the law and well within the legitimate bounds of prosecutorial discretion. And then you get to the actual case itself and the seemingly endless infirmities with it. As Andy McCarthy told us earlier this week, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York in Manhattan, and wrote in the New York Post as well, Bragg is attempting to enforce either federal election laws that a state prosecutor lacks jurisdiction to enforce or state election laws that do not apply to U.S. presidential elections with respect to the ostensible campaign finance violation play to establish the other crime being concealed such that you can level up the business records violation alleged to a felony. It's I don't know. It's incoherent only because of Alvin Bragg's tortured cobbling together of these charges.
Yeah, they call that chicken wired.
Yeah,
Back where I come from.
That's a pretty good description. Let's get another description from Professor Richard Epstein. He's the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Well, I would say this is a dubious honor given the topic that we're about to talk about.
Well, as you have been watching and reviewing and listening to the competing arguments, how do you assess the quality of this case?
Well, I think basically the previous reporter got it right. It's a federal offense, and so it should be exclusively within the jurisdiction of the federal government if you're enforcing a federal claim. And if it's a state claim, you can't do it with respect to this particular transaction. They have no jurisdiction over it. The one point that I would want to add about all of this is a real question about state and local jurisdiction. And I think it's absolutely incumbent upon the Attorney General of the United States to say, I'm running 2 investigations of Mr. Trump, which are perfectly within the scope of federal power, and it's utterly impermissible for anybody to try to usurp federal jurisdiction by bringing up this weird state claim. But what's happened, of course, is the Biden administration is completely quiet about all of this. They don't say anything. Their political agenda is to make sure that Trump screams and yells, makes himself look like a fool, and they think it's going to improve the Biden chance for re-election. The second point I would make right off the thing is 34 counts is the lead in every particular story. And you hinted at it when you said this was chopping things up. You're not allowed to split a cause of action. And so if you have one count of trying to bribe a woman instead of one count of writing a book entry and another of sending a check and so forth, it's a maximum of 4 years penalty. If you multiply 4 by 34, it turns out, you have Trump in jail until he's 200 years age, still full bullinating about what's going on. It's an
Still
utterly
running for
illegitimate
president.
practice.
Yeah.
What?
And still running for
Utterly
president.
illegitimate
200.
practice.
Yeah.
Utterly illegitimate. I mean, Bragg sort of announces that nobody's above the law, but I could tell you at least one person who is, and that's Bragg himself. He runs on a campaign to denounce Trump and to say, I'm going to get him in one way or another. And then what he does, he becomes the blind servant of justice when he announces he looks just at the facts and just at the evidence and just at the weight of the case, and then brings this preposterous indictment. Now, the thing, of course, about it is even the judicial situation is very strange. One does not quite know what to make of the fact that the next hearing is supposed to be in December, which is a long time from now, and starts to get you into the middle of the presidential campaign. It's also very unclear as to what Trump can and may say in these times. One could say, well, maybe we have to put him under house arrest because he's being subject to a charge for an indictment. But the Trump people are going to keep this in the news, rightly so, in my view, by arguing that the indictment is insufficient in so many ways. We've talked about some of them. Let me just mention one other to you. What they do is they say in aid of a felony, and then you look and say, what felony? And it's to be named later. You're supposed to defend the case when you don't know what you're charged with. And so it seems to me that they can make up their mind about the applicable substantive statute they want to incorporate and put it in there. They claim they don't have to do so. So the first question is, how do you prepare a defense if you don't have notice of the particular charge? This is not due process fancy style. This is due process Roman law, due process medieval English law, due process every law any way you want to look on the face of the civilized globe. So this whole thing has a kind of a surreal atmosphere, and I think the ultimate story is Bragg is not that stupid, and so he must know that there are holes in the case, even though he talks as though they're not. He doesn't care really very much whether he secures the conviction or not. What he's trying to do is to make Trump look stronger in the eyes of Republicans, so he'll get the nomination, and then make Trump look worse in the eyes of the general public, so he'll lose the presidential election. It's really a very, very sordid story that we're watching out here. And what it does is it indicates the kind of general decline that you have in public mores when prosecutors, not constrained by the law, have always had an internal check on the things that they start to do. But weaponization is an accurate term to describe this thing. And then when you start reading the apologies in the various newspapers like Nicholas Kristof and the New York Times, they're always saying, well, we fold these two things together. But you basically already explained that the folding has never taken these proportions. And the one question you would want to ask is, if this thing were right within the statute of limitations, 2 years, right? It happened yesterday. Would you be able to enforce it under New York law? Answer no. So now that you got a 7-year delay, it doesn't make the federal case in state court any stronger. So what you're watching here is the slow decline of public morality in the United States. And I want to hold the Biden administration complicit because they have the duty to protect their jurisdiction and to make sure that once they make a decision that somebody is not to be prosecuted at the federal level, it cannot be done by any one of 10,000 state or local attorneys running on a political agenda.
Well, to your point about the mindset here, nicely encapsulated by Paul Krugman, writing in the New York Times, Trump's indictment is karmic justice regardless of the verdict. So now the justice system is about karmic justice, which is political justice. It's not about the rule of law, and they're fine with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, Paul Krugman always speaks about things of which he knows nothing, and this is yet another occasion in which what he does is he takes his own political biases and inserts them into what should be a very serious kind of consideration. You want to have karmic justice. What you do is you go up into the sky and you write an imaginary indictment, which you then present to the public at large and ask them to vote against the man. I mean, I will make it clear for the record, I think one of the real terrible things about this is that there are many things wrong with Trump's character which are not criminal. There are very strong reasons to oppose him, the most important of which is every time he makes the right point, he's the wrong guy making it. So what happens is the arguments become diminished. You could find somebody else who believes much of what he did and let that person run for president. And so Trump is, I think, unforgivably egoistic when he starts to decide that he's going to run again. His program was so much better than Biden's. It's an embarrassment, even though Trump himself made some real howlers in the way in which he berated people. He basically didn't enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership on free trade and so forth. But compared to the man who's in office now, he was an intellectual giant as the president. And I mean, just as one little illustration, this pathetic report, which the Defense Department indicates, to say that Joe should have gotten out sooner rather than not at all, is just the way in which this entire administration tries to turn abject failure in every domain into a triumphant diplomatic initiative.
I just want to get back to Trump's defense strategy. When we talked to Andy McCarthy earlier in the week, as I mentioned, he said, look, if I was his defense attorney, I'd file a motion to dismiss for failure to state a claim right now. Do you agree with that?
Well, I would do it first on jurisdiction. So as to try to get the thing out. I mean, the most important thing is for this thing to end quickly. And if you concede the jurisdiction of the court under these circumstances, then even the motion to dismiss on this kind of a claim is going to take much longer to resolve. So it's not that he's wrong. The way you state that is essentially you did not give the name of the second essential offense. The risk about that is, all right, Webb says you want to dismiss this, give me the right to amend, and I'm going to amend, and now I will name you the statute, and then you're going to have to go through the cycle again. But if you take Andy's first point about the fact that you can't enforce federal law in state court and that state law is inapplicable to a federal case, then that ends this thing. I think it's actually a cleaner and a stronger argument to do this. What's going to happen, of course, is they're going to do both in one way or another, and we will see what happens. And they should follow probably another situation to say you've got to collapse these 34 crimes into one particular situation. It's a payment to Mr. Cohen for what's going on here. Well, the whole thing, I think, therefore, has this kind of sordid situation. Comment now until you see the indictments, if they're going to come forward, about what Jack Smith is doing in D.C. with Mar-a-Lago or what's happening in Georgia with the election recount. But at least those cases do not have the two major defects that one cites here. There is certainly federal jurisdiction over these activities, and you certainly can file a robust complaint that doesn't look like it was generated by a demented first-year law student. I mean, if you actually ask yourself the question, how long did it take to draft a complaint which is fact-free on virtually every essential, it probably took something like about an hour to generate. The real fight inside the prosecution was not how to draft this miserable thing, but whether to file it at all. And they made the wrong decision, but they made the wrong decision for the wrong reasons, which makes it even worse than otherwise. I think this will go down as a travesty in justice, and I think one has to be very careful when you talk about Trump to distinguish between your objections to his political program and his personality on the one hand, and the great eagerness to find all sorts of criminal activities to chase him with. Remember, this is pretty sordid. You compare what happened to Hillary Clinton in 2015 when she was allowed to walk after all sorts of incredible concessions made to her by the FBI on activities that were utterly illegal, like using the home server, to which she then pleads, well, I didn't know it was illegal, which is an utterly useless defense as well in law and probably false in a matter of fact. And then with Trump, you get the Steele investigation, you get the Flynn situations, you get the double impeachments and so forth. I mean, I think he has a right to be somewhat neurotic because it's quite clear that the Democrats from day one have thought that the criminal prosecutions was a perfectly legitimate way to oppose somebody with whom they have very strong disagreements on substantive grounds. And this is really the great tragedy of American life. I think, in effect, the way in which Garland, a horrible disappointment as the Attorney General of the United States, and Biden have proceeded, have been the most lawless and reckless thing that has gone. So essentially, put the question to you this way. Donald Trump, does he fulminate? Answer yes. Does he issue any indictments? No. What Trump is about is being essentially petulant and self-pitying, and then he says some crazy things. But the key difference between him and Biden is that somebody could walk Trump back from the ledge so he doesn't file the indictment. So what we do is we get angry at him for fulminating, whereas for Biden and for Garland and for all these other guys, what you do is you get angry from what they've done. It is utterly inexcusable for the federal government not to assert exclusive jurisdiction over this particular case. And what have they done? They've remained completely silent on this kind of an issue. That is not the way to run a federal government.
That's the old saying that it's not paranoia if they are actually out to get you. To your point.
Although in his case it's a rare double. It's not out paranoia because they're out to get him, but it is paranoia because oftentimes he manages to assume all sorts of other attacks upon his person are motivated in the same way. The man is an incredibly divisive feature. And what happens is he's managed to blow 3 elections for the Republican. If the Lord were kind to everybody, Trump would have enough sense to back out of this thing so he doesn't lead the Republican Party to a disaster in the 4th election. I mean, let us look at the situation, and there's a very simple rule that you can follow in these cases. What you do is you look at policies of the kind that Trump supports and the kind that Biden supports and look at them at the state level. And sure enough, every time you look at Illinois, you look at California, you look at New York, they're cratering economically, socially, and morally. Then you look at these Republican states, these terrible Republican states like Texas, Florida, and Tennessee, and they're thriving. Well, there's a lesson in all of this, and the lesson is that you cannot essentially run an economy into the ground on the one hand while silencing your opposition with false charges of criminal behavior.
He is Professor Richard Epstein, James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor, Emeritus of Law, Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thank you as always. Appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye. And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
The more you listen, the more you'll know. This is Chicago's Morning Answer. Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Drowning in IRS debt? If you can't afford to pay your IRS debt due to economic hardship, you can now be free of IRS collection efforts by taking advantage of a special IRS tax hardship program. This program allows Americans who owe the IRS to resolve their delinquent tax debt once and for all. In some cases, maybe even reducing what you owe significantly. An open phone line has been established by Community Tax for consumers to call and see if they qualify. Simply dial 800-500-5588. If you owe back taxes to the IRS and cannot afford to pay them back or have years of unfiled tax returns, help is standing by. Just call the Community Tax Helpline today at 800-500-5588 for the help that you need. Don't take on the IRS alone. They can attack your wages, savings, pension, home, and even your Social Security check. Call 800-500-5588 to see if you qualify. That's 800-500-5588.
Real estate, it's a moving target. If you need a real pro to help you, that's Annette Kelovec. She knows the western suburbs. A multi-million-dollar agent that offers integrity, honesty, and yes, a sense of humor for this important part of your life. Annette will take care of it all and take the stress out of listing your home or looking for the right home for you and your family. If you're listening, Annette knows how to help you get top dollar and will bring the buyers. If you're looking, her decades of experience will make the process of finding what you want a lot easier.